Joining us now to break this all down, Shawn Robbins, Chief Analyst over at BoxOffice.com. Shawn, good morning. Good to see you as always. So what can we expect from this first step towards returning to theaters here in New York? This seems like a big move for the theaters.
Good morning. It's a big step. It's a big, I think, a progression that's been long awaited by the industry. Obviously, factors outside the film business's control have been at play for the past year, but New York City has been shuttered for almost exactly 12 months as of later this month. So this is a big step toward recovery. And at this point, we're seeing more and more major markets like New York City and San Francisco reopen this week. Now the final piece to the puzzle will be Los Angeles, which, speculation is that that could happen within a few weeks, but we'll see. But for now, the industry is just happy to see, even at reduced capacity, 25% seating or 50 people at the most in New York City. It's kind of that first signal toward maybe studios being able to rely on keeping their release schedule for this year, as well as consumer confidence growing again.
Absolutely, Shawn. And it's interesting because for the last couple of weeks, we've even seen the box office numbers start to improve over time. I think only about 40% of theaters are open right now. Does this give you an indication that consumers are still willing to go back to theaters, given the fact that so much stuff has been on streaming over the course of the last year? People are excited to get back out into the theater.
It does. Last weekend was a great example of that with Tom and Jerry coming out and really beating essentially every expectation in the middle of a pandemic. We're still talking about numbers that are far from normal. It will take time to get there, I think. But in addition to what we've seen here in North America, we've seen other countries, China being the prime example right now of how moviegoing can rebound as a recovery from the pandemic begins. China just set all sorts of box office records over its Lunar New Year last month. Other countries like Korea, Japan, France, Spain have seen more robust recoveries as they've come out of lockdown. Even going back into certain lockdowns and coming out of lockdowns, there tends to be this recovery period. And we think the same thing will happen here in North America. To your point, last weekend, I think Tom and Jerry was another great example. This weekend, we have Disney releasing its first film in a year with Raya and the Last Dragon, and we've seen positive sales for that. So now it'll just be a matter of March and April being this period of transition to get the word back out about theaters, for people to feel safe about going back, and to continue to watch cases decline and vaccines roll out. That's been the most important factor.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Raya and the Last Dragon. Obviously, Disney banking on this movie doing well this weekend. Is this almost, because I'm glad you mentioned Tom and Jerry, because it had the best numbers we've seen in like almost a year at the box office, even though the numbers were still dismal compared to what you typically see at the box office. How much is Raya and the Last Dragon this weekend sort of a good case study for what the future of the box office is going to look like?
It certainly is a template, and it's still abnormal in that it will be released on streaming at the same time. Tom and Jerry was released to HBO Max for free to its subscribers, whereas Raya is being released as an additional $30 charge to Disney Plus subscribers. But of course, that's a service that has a considerable number more higher user base, I should say. So this is an experiment in some ways, but I think the theaters that are choosing to show this, which are the majority of them, are just happy to have the new content right now. And at this point, we're now waiting to see what Disney does in the future. We've seen other studios like Paramount and Universal come to something of a middle ground in terms of agreeing to theatrical windows and how long films can exclusively play in cinemas. Paramount being notable, saying 30 to 45 days for their biggest titles, which is a reasonable estimation. It's really not going to be a significant impact to what box office earnings would be for the majority of films. The expectation is most studios might gravitate around that to some level, but Disney is still the one that hasn't been very specific in their future plans. And as of now, their next big release after Raya is Marvel's Black Widow, to which they are, at the moment, committing to a theatrical exclusive release. So that's slated for early May, and we'll see what develops over the next few months in terms of getting to that point.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because I'm glad you brought that up, because Bob Chapek at Disney has essentially said, who knows what's going to happen with the theatrical window. We know Warner Media has decided to put all of their huge slates of movies for this year on HBO Max. There's just a lot of concern and also questions about what the industry is going to look like. Just in your honest opinion, Shawn, how do you sort of see this playing out? Do you continue to see maybe a theatrical window where movies are only in theaters for 30 days and then go on streaming platforms? Or do you sort of see things turning out the way that they're doing on HBO Max, where you're seeing things simultaneously in a theater and a streaming platform at the same time?
It's a great question, and it's the billion-dollar question. And I think my view is that what we're seeing right now in terms of Warner Brothers' strategy in particular is a pandemic response. It is a strategy designed to handle what's going on in the short term, whereas I think other studios, particularly Universal and Paramount, with their official announcements, have a little bit more of a long game view in terms of supporting theaters. And I think Warner Brothers will be in that group as well. But that's the dynamic that we're seeing so far. And I do think ultimately we'll see these films coexist with streaming because the studios need that theatrical revenue in order to justify some of these bigger budgets of films. And there's a certain event level stature that comes from theatrical releases. But at the same time, these studios and their parent companies want to grow their streaming services. So, it's a matter of essentially walking and chewing gum at the same time. These companies are capable of doing both in the long term. As we come out on the other side of the pandemic, I think we'll see a lot more compromise found in some of the agreements, but it won't be a one size fits all. I think we'll see certain studios achieve or aim for certain windows, whereas others may be slightly shorter or slightly longer, and it will depend on the film as well. So it's really just going to be a case by case basis.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out for the rest of the year. Shawn, always a pleasure to have you here. Shawn Robbins, Chief Analyst over at Box Office Pro.